Great. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction and just wonderful to be here. I'm so glad to have been invited to be a part of this really important event. As was mentioned, I'm the Sinyi professor at Cambridge University. I just joined Cambridge about a year ago, and a lot of the work I do, even though the title is Professor of Chinese Management, is mostly about sustainability, social impact, social innovation. Part of my research is on China as well. Today I'm going to be talking mainly about this global movement around B corporations and how all businesses can learn from this movement. But I just want to say it's wonderful to be part in some ways of the Sinyi family at NCCU and also the Sinyi Fang Wu. When I was thinking about joining Cambridge about a year ago, I talked to some Taiwanese friends and they spoke so highly of the company Sinyi and also the work they've done here at NCCU. So to be here for part of this 10th anniversary is very special to me. So thank you. Thank you all for the invitation. It's great. Also, it's a real honor to follow Professor Xu, who I know is legendary in business management and education in Taiwan and around the world. And I'm so honored that you actually read my book and had very interesting and helpful comments on it. And I'm going to be talking about some of the details of implementing these processes within organizations. I think that having ethics and values is obviously fundamental, but many leaders, I really think, that want to do well, that have good values, struggle because actually the processes, the tools, the management techniques to drive those changes through the organization are a challenge because in many ways the capitalist system around the world is set up to really focus business on profits. And that's where I think this B Corp movement that I'm going to say a little bit about is really important. This afternoon, actually, there's going to be in one of the breakout side sessions, a couple B Corps talking. And if you want to learn more about B corporations, you should definitely attend that. If you are not aware of this term, these are companies that are certified for their social and environmental performance. It's a global movement, thousands of organizations. As I'll talk about, hundreds of thousands of companies are using the tools that they've developed. Started in the US, but is very deep in Europe, Latin America, and increasingly in Asia. I think that Taiwan is actually one of the really leading spots in Asia of this movement. Okay. There's a mainland Chinese version of the book called 商业进化。对不起，我的中文说得不太好，所以我用英文。Professor Xu 他用中文，我用英文。So I really hope that there can be a Taiwanese version as well. Sort of a infantiza, and so hopefully, if any of you know publishers or want to be in touch about doing that, please do, because, like I said, I think that there's a great market for this here. These ideas that I'll talk about. Okay. Okay. As Professor Xu mentioned, I think one of the things that really makes all of our work so important as business leaders, board members, students wanting to go into business is that the world today is really at a very difficult point. You have climate change, where there's climate disasters, all kinds of problems increasing. I know Taiwan, the sort of severity of disasters has increased over the last number of years. You have issues of global inequality. Since 1980, the level of inequality has gone up about 3 or 4-fold. And business and the model of capitalism, so to speak, around the world, I think really can actually be tied to that in a very substantial way, both as a causal agent, but then also as a way to help resolve it, which I think is why all of us are here. We all want to actually make the world a better place, and actually, government is very important, nonprofits and NGOs are very important, but also business and actually having a commercial engine to do good is another really important way to actually make the world better. One of the reasons why this is important, as Professor Xu had mentioned, is that the current paradigm that we are in around business management is shareholder value maximization. He talked about sort of the opposite, which people are really trying to move us towards a much more stakeholder-oriented process. But the shareholder paradigm has existed for about 50 years now. I don't think we have 50 years to actually change back to what was going on before, but I do think it's very deeply embedded. As you can see here, this quote says, "The planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we create a lot of value for shareholders." And I think what this really describes is that businesses are really very, very much attuned to short-term profits, less so broader stakeholder interests. And of course, business is business, so profits are very important, but also holding them accountable for environmental damage, inequalities that they put on society. Professor Xu mentioned these ideas of externalities. These are the costs that, for instance, like pollution, there's health costs, other damage from, environmental issues that really we as society bear, and ways to think about holding companies accountable for that is important as well. So you can see here, as I mentioned, this idea of connecting the change in paradigm to more of a shareholder value paradigm from a much more stakeholder value paradigm, which was in place before the 1960s or 70s. We live in this world today, and we think that actually businesses primarily delivering sort of profits to shareholders is sort of the natural way to do things. But actually, there's work in history and sociology and other disciplines that describe how, throughout history and actually up until the 1950s, actually business was much more responsive to stakeholders. It was much more embedded in its communities, much more of a long-term orientation to actually have more of a win-win and take responsibility for the cost that it puts on society. So this has been directly connected to issues of environmental degradation. If companies are held to very, very short-term profit expectations, things like equipment for smokestacks and other items get sort of put off into the future, maybe never done. Also, executive compensation has been tied to share price because of this interest in very short-term shareholder return, and this has created an escalation in CEO pay, which I think is an example of the increasing inequalities in our world. You can see in 1970 or so, there was only about 20 to 1 CEO to average worker pay, and this has just skyrocketed. So, really this last 50 years, this paradigm that Professor Xu mentioned and changing the paradigm, this in and of itself is not sort of the natural way of the world. It is actually, cross-culturally and actually historically, there's been a much different way of doing business, which we'll talk about. Okay, so a lot of actors have recognized in some ways that the world is at a breaking point. The World Economic Forum, right before COVID in January 2020, sort of the theme was, as you can see here, stakeholder capitalism, a manifesto for a cohesive and sustainable world, the Business Roundtable, which is a trade group of about the 200 largest companies in America, actually in late 2019 changed its statement on the purpose of the corporation to say it's much more stakeholder driven. And obviously we have the the COP meetings, just recently in Egypt, and then also actually in Montreal, were meetings where businesses, government leaders, NGOs, come together to talk about, COP27, that's about climate change. COP15, which was in Montreal, is much more about biodiversity. And I think that these are examples of, how, this multi-stakeholder process of businesses playing an important role with NGOs and governments as well. The thing is that though there is a lot of talk about stakeholder capitalism and doing the best for communities, employees, but there's a lot of examples as well of greenwashing. I don't know if you know this term greenwashing, but it's really where companies are saying they're doing well, but actually are not. It's sort of a marketing ploy in some way to convince consumers and others that they're green. So you sort of greenwash. I don't know if you know, I was thinking about this morning as I was getting ready to come over here. Actually, this term greenwashing came about from the hotel industry. So in the hotel where I'm staying here in Taipei, there is a card in my hotel room saying, we care about the environment. Don't put your towel on the ground. Hang it up and you can use it tomorrow because, we all want to save the environment. So in the 1980s, a hotel exec, when they started actually introducing these, a hotel executive wrote an article and said, we actually don't really care about the environment. We care about profits. Actually, not washing the towel saves us money. It saves wear on the towel. So, this is not, you shouldn't be fooled. I still hang up my towel because I do think even if the company is saving money, it is a good thing to do. But I think this idea of greenwashing more generally is a serious issue. And I think that, we need to actually think about companies' claims and hold them accountable. And this is one reason why I think the B Corp movement is very important, because these are companies that have been sort of assessed and evaluated and certified for actually being socially responsible. The reason why I think in a lot of ways maybe companies get called out for this, it's not necessarily that they're bad companies or they, are sort of trying to trick us. I think in some cases, maybe the companies are trying to trick consumers and the general public, but I think a lot of it is that it's just actually very hard. The systems in the world, the laws, the norms that are set up actually are very focused on delivering value for shareholders. There's been legal changes in the United States and in many countries throughout the world, so that businesses' legal responsibility is to deliver value to shareholders. And the directors, the executives of the company can be sued if they don't do that. There's a bunch of laws in the US passed in the 1980s, Australia, the UK, and I'm not sure about the laws in Taiwan, but a number of countries have also adopted these laws. And this is the idea of a paradigm that Professor Xu was talking about. You have this sort of way the world is operating, and it's about a variety of rules and laws and norms. And this shareholder value paradigm, if we're to change it, it takes a lot of effort from all of us. Great. So this idea of going from shareholders to stakeholders is a really, really big challenge for companies. And to follow on Professor Xu's talk, I think values and ethics are foundational. No doubt about that. But I also think that in addition to that, in actually absolutely essential are actually helping leaders with the tools and processes to actually make those changes and recognize that in some ways they're swimming against the tide, because the way that the system is set up actually makes it harder for them to do that. So that's actually the theme of the book that I wrote. So, it's called The B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. And you may think that the goal of my book is to try to convince companies to become these B corporations, which I think is an amazing aspiration because it's a very rigorous and a very impressive, set of standards. And I, really respect a lot the B corporations. However, really why I wrote the book and the goal of it and why I am very inspired by this movement is that they have provided a bunch of tools and processes, basically, that all businesses can use, not just B corporations. These are open source, free, legal changes. They've actually changed, this movement has changed laws in I think about 10 countries around the world on 4 different continents. So now there's a new type of company where the directors and directors are not legally obliged to deliver shareholder value. And so this is what I'm going to talk about, these two different, sort of one axis being this ESG assessment, being very important, not just reporting, but actually, being assessed and accountable on that. And then so that's sort of the y-axis, and the x-axis is around governance and the legal changes that have been occurring around the world in creating a new corporate form that actually is in the sort of DNA of the company, the articles of incorporation of the company, focused on broader sets of stakeholders. So when you put these together and the company scores above a threshold, companies can become B Corps. There's a lot of them around the world. Many of them in the U.S. You see Patagonia is one of the more famous ones. Ben & Jerry Ice Cream Company. And I think there's about 40 or so now in Taiwan. Here's a couple. So I have Domi and Obank are two in Taiwan. There's two others that are speaking this afternoon. You can see DE Fanying there. It's the first B Corp in mainland China. There's about 40 in mainland China as well. Roshan, it's the largest telecommunications provider in Afghanistan, as an example. Tony's Chocolonely, I don't know if that's a company that has actually been introduced here yet, but it's a company that provides traceable chocolate, because actually, sadly speaking, there's still a lot of child labor and slavery in our modern world in the chocolate supply chain. And this Tony's Chocolonely was a journalist actually doing a story, learned about this, and said, I need to find a way to actually change this. Started this chocolate company, and now this is a really sort of very popular chocolate company. So lots of them. Natura is another one I just want to mention. It's a Brazilian cosmetics company, tens of billions of dollars. It owns Avon, you might know of. It owns The Body Shop. So this is one of the larger of these B Corps. So I'm going to talk first about the impact assessment tools. Okay. So here's an example of what this looks like. So to try to actually meet a broad set of stakeholder needs, you can see this assessment is divided into a number of different sections: governance, workers, community, environment, and consumers. Patagonia, I think you might be familiar with. I've seen people in Taiwan the few days I've been here wearing Patagonia things. It's a company that is really founded with an environmental ethos of, actually trying to, the mission statement of the company is like, our mission is, we're in business to change, to make the environment better. I guess I probably should have reviewed that before I tried to quote it, but that's basically it. They actually are wanting to, through business, make a positive difference on climate change, biodiversity issues, et cetera. And that really is a guiding mission of the company. You can see, things like the environment and governance, our community are, because they're very active in community on these issues and supporting parks. The thing that I think is important to note, though, is how going through these ESG processes is in some ways a benchmark process for change. So you can see in 2011, they did this and got 107. And then over time, they actually increase. And this is something, when I did the research for the book, was really incredibly salient from so many of the leaders I talked to, is that, this was so important for them because it created a pathway for getting better. Actually going through this process, they start and they learn more about their company. There's actually ways to benchmark with other companies to learn best practices. There's a natural competitiveness in all of us and among companies that, okay, if you get 107 one year, you don't want to get 107 or 106 the next year. You actually want to do better. So actually being part of these ESG assessment is actually a natural mechanism for self-reinforcement and positive change and benchmarking over time. So this is, what a number of the interviews I had said, way to understand your company, a tool for continuous improvement and change, platform to compare and learn. Like I mentioned, this is a way to benchmark what other companies are doing and learn from them. And also just in some ways, a holistic view of the business. Many of the companies I talked to, they had said, entrepreneurs are not necessarily the best managers. People that have an idea, a passion for their product, and they sort of off and running, and they hire people and maybe don't put in place the processes and procedures that actually sort of protect the rights and deliver the correct benefits to employees. So this is a way to actually, in some ways, beyond just the social responsibility component, create like sort of almost a management 101, so the company can be on sort of better management footing. And this is why I think that so many leading investors around the world have been giving a lot of attention to the ESG idea. So the person on your left here, Larry Fink, he's the CEO, founder of BlackRock, which manages, I think it's $8 trillion, one of the largest, if not the largest, private asset management companies in the world. Every year he writes a letter to the companies in which he is a shareholder or owner. And the last 3 or 4 of these, he has articulated a need for those businesses to be super focused on ESG issues. Things like climate change, things like being accountable for social and environmental impacts. The reason being, I don't know Larry Fink, so I don't want to say anything bad about him necessarily. I don't think that he cares, to be honest, that much about social and environmental impact. He cares about performance. And what he says is actually companies that are accountable and reporting on their ESG, they have lower long-term risk, and they're better managed. And that really ends up with better performance. So he is a big proponent of this, but very much trying to connect the driver to economic performance, which is a whole other issue, which I think Professor Xu and I will talk about in our panel discussion as to, does this really, is this really a new paradigm? And sort of my answer would be, if you're justifying things based on share price, then you're not necessarily in a new paradigm, because it's still sort of boiling down to, performance of the company. So, but how do we get past that is another question. A number of governments are actually mandating this in the EU, in the UK, and also in the US. There's increasing government in the the securities regulators wanting companies to report on these issues, and the reason being is that these are material financial potential risks that the company has. So things like risk to climate change, carbon, and diversity issues are things that actually might create long-term financial risk for the company. So they need to report them so that actually their investors know about them. One company that I've studied, which someone mentioned, is known here as Chloé, the French fashion house. So I've been to Paris a couple times. This is one of the great things about moving to the UK. It's much easier. There's a 2-hour train that can get you right to Paris from London. And I've gotten to know somewhat well the CEO of Chloé, Riccardo Bellini. And how I got to know him is that Chloé is a recent B Corporation. And I was really interested to learn why and how they became a B Corporation and what it actually means for their brand. Because if you think about it in some ways, fashion is almost the opposite of sustainability. It's sort of luxury, opulence, sort of promoting consumerism at times. And how does that actually square with actually trying to be sustainable and focus on ESG issues? The first point I want to make is what the quote up here says, which you told me, is that basically they wanted to become a better business, so to speak, a more sustainable organization. This was one of the mandates that he was given when he was hired as CEO in 2018. And this B Impact Assessment, which is the ESG measurement and management tool from the B Corp community, they found was actually a really good tool just in general to learn about the business and become more sustainable. As a result, they've entirely changed the materials they use, the design and sourcing of a lot of their of their different fashion pieces. But he said, we use this tool as just a way to make ourselves better. We never really thought actually would become a B Corp until actually after a couple years, they were improving to such an extent. They said, okay, maybe this is something we can, sort of go for. And now actually the group, there's, LVMH and Kering Group, and the conglomerate that Chloe is part of is the Richemont Group. So I've met also a number of times with the head of sustainability for Richemont. And so they're actually using these tools also through the whole portfolio of their companies to actually make their companies better. So again, this is an idea of, by thinking about ESG and introducing ESG ideas as a way to actually improve the company in a more sustainable way. Yeah, so this is an example where 250,000 companies on an annual basis are using these tools. And this is just this one type of tool. You probably heard of the Global Reporting Initiative. There's SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. Recently in the climate space, there's TCFD. I don't know if people have heard of this, Task Force on Climate Disclosure. But these are all tools that probably millions of companies now are using to actually continuously improve their operations. And there's pros and cons of each of them, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you want. But I actually really do like the B impact assessment for a couple reasons. So one, it's something that can be used by companies of all sizes. It's tailored to different geographies and different industries. But also it actually provides benchmarking assessment, so companies can actually learn as they go through the process. It's not just a neutral framework. And I put these financial institutions up here. This is BDC, which is Business Development Bank of Canada, and Bank of Colombia in South America. Both of these banks use this tool as a screening mechanism for potential lendees. A number of impact investors and actually just regular mainstream venture capital companies also use similar tools or this tool, because again, these are ways to actually get deep in the company and understand how it's performing in a fundamental way. Yeah, so here's an example just of some of the investees. You have, I don't know if these venture capital companies on your left-hand side here, I mean, these are the most high prestige, well-known venture capital companies in the world. Really, most of them are in Silicon Valley, and all of them are investing in these social impact companies. My sense, again, maybe they could be greenwashing, but I'm not. I don't think that's the case, because these companies are actually certified. They've changed their legal structure. And they've, so they're accountable on a regular basis on these metrics. They could just. So I really think that they are actually seeing economic value in these companies, which again sort of goes along with sort of the thesis I've been talking about. Many of them are going public. I had dinner with some of the Taiwanese B Corps last night, and someone told me that there's now 45. Public companies around the world. Obank is, I think, the only public Taiwanese company that is a B Corp. It was actually, from what I understand, the 7th public B Corp. But now, in the U.S. markets, there's scores of them. These are all U.S. listed, either NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange companies. Okay, so this was the idea that ESG impact assessment is not only important for the environment, society, which is more important than ever, but also really important just as a way to manage your business in a more effective way. Investors are saying it, businesses are saying it too. So I'm going to say a little bit about the x-axis here, which is the governance axis. Okay, so this idea of legal changes to the company to actually embed stakeholder management within the legal articles of incorporation, in some ways the DNA of the company, has been spreading around the world. You can see here, so it started actually just a little bit over 10 years ago in the United States. In the US, corporate law is governed at the state level, so sort of state by state. Maryland, the state of Maryland was the first in 2010 to pass this law called benefit corporations. I'll say in a second, let me see what benefit corporations are. Let me skip to that slide real quick. Yeah, so benefit corporation, the company has to have actually an articulated purpose beyond shareholder value maximization, also has to be accountable and transparent for that. There's a number of reasons why companies are finding this useful. Protecting directors, sending signal to investors and stakeholders, et cetera. And I'm sure we can circulate these slides. I won't go through those, all the reasons in detail. But basically, this is actually trying to change the law that is really focusing companies on short-term profits. So as you can see here, this is so when it passed in the state of Delaware, which is where most companies that are public in the United States are legally domiciled, it then actually sort of jumped over to Italy, and now a number of countries around the world have passed this law. From South America, Africa, Rwanda recently actually introduced this law. Still not in Asia. I know a little bit ago, actually, Taiwan had been thinking about it, but actually, that was a while ago. I understand from my discussions last night that this really sort of off the agenda. So maybe some of you can continue, sort of trying to push this forward. Okay. The UK is actually taking this to the next level, actually. There is work in the United Kingdom to actually change the default type of company to being one that is responsible to all stakeholders. So this would be, the other laws I described are voluntary. Companies can opt into it when they're doing their IPO, or some companies, sort of convert. But if you think about how change happens in the world, in some ways the change happens, sort of this was introduced in the United States. In some ways it ripples out, travels to Europe, travels to South America, over to Africa. And so now those were all voluntary. In some ways the next big ripple out is actually making it to be the mandatory type of company. And this would be a huge deal. This was actually getting a lot of traction about a year ago, but the UK has been through a lot of tumult over the last year. So it's sort of, is coming back online, I understand. Taiwan, a little bit about Taiwan. So there's actually been a vibrant movement in Taiwan. So former President Ma actually, sort of praised this movement while he was in office, I believe, attended an opening of a summit for B Corps, and describes many of the things I said here. He says it's a way of accountability and public transparency mechanisms to provide greater benefit to stakeholders. It was in 2016. This is a list of the about 40 B Corps you can see here. So maybe some brands that you sort of know of or frequent. A couple of them, like I said, are going to be talking this afternoon, so you should definitely want to learn more. Okay. People ask me, okay, so what are the reasons why companies would want to do this? I think it's natural to think it might be about sort of the brand reputation of the company. And I know Professor Shu's background is in marketing, and maybe he sees the marketing benefit of the social impact, or maybe the downsides. But I'm actually from an organization and management background, so where I see the real in some ways benefit to companies are in the systems and processes within the company actually making change in the culture, in the structures, and this actually creates change that lasts. So I think this is a really big benefit. I think also employees. So many of the companies I've talked to said, this dramatically changed the culture of my company going through this processes. Now my employee retention is through the roof. I have lines of people out the door, sort of attracting new talent. I think younger folks today, maybe some of you, really want to have a purpose of the company they work for, have a purpose. And this is a way that you can really sort of win in the talent market. One of the people that is in sort of a unique industry that I interviewed said to me, people in my industry, they asked me, like, this B Corp thing, why did you do it? What she said is, my response is, she said, is that basically I don't have to have an HR department because no one leaves. No one leaves, and I have a line of people out the door if I actually want to hire someone. So it's a really pretty easy thing. So this is really important, employee culture changes. It's also well aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The UN SDGs are really important, targets for the world. The UN is very focused on, governments, states, regions, cities. These SDGs were not necessarily set for companies to actually be focused on or make progress to, and so there's a syncing between the B impact assessment and the SDGs, so the companies can understand, what SDGs are most important for them and actually how they can continue to improve on them. So I think that actually having a global set of goals is really, really important. I think that, this connection with the SDGs is really significant. Finally, I just want to say a little bit about responsible production and consumption. This is SDG 12. And I do think sort of all of us as consumers, maybe some folks that work in businesses, sort of producing products, it's really incumbent on all of us to make this change. To think about, when we're buying products, is it sustainably produced in ethical fashion? Because without that, it's going to be really, really hard to actually encourage companies to make this change. Certainly the business process and investor impact aspects are important as well, but consumers and all of us, and that actually, sort of comes down to all of us. So just as, if you remember anything from my discussion this morning, it's, as you're buying things, maybe buy less, buy better things, and look at the label and where it's produced and how it's produced. So finally, just as a little bit of wrap up, a number of companies that I've talked to have used the term future proofing. So thinking about actually going through these processes as a way to set their company up for the long term. The world is really, I think, at a breaking point in many ways. It's why the World Economic Forum, the Business Roundtable are focusing on this. I don't think I hope that maybe many of those leaders care, but I think also they're worried that their legitimacy and their position will be challenged if they actually don't step up voluntarily. And so I think that actually, but thinking about these issues strategically through ESG assessment is a way to actually make the business better. Governance as the foundation of the company needs to be aligned. CEOs can't just say they're going to do things. Companies can't just actually, in some ways, do sustainable work themselves. It actually has to be aligned within the governance of the company. Investors are caring about this, employees are caring about this, and so really this is a way for companies to, create a unique identity so that they can access consumers and actually, sustainable for the long run. So with that, thank you very much. Really enjoyed talking to you and look forward to, I don't know if there's Q&A or at least I'll be having a chance to discuss with Professor Xu in a minute.